before we go to the panel, I want to introduce Andrew Yo, who is the CMO of Nillion, to say a few words.
Hey guys, so we are really excited to be here. You know, it's such an interesting time that we're living in. Honestly, it feels like yesterday that Andrew Massanto over there called me and Alex and said, hey, you have a PayPal account, can you buy this thing called Ethereum, and then can you send it all to me? You know, this was in 2017, I remember Ethereum was about $20, and that was actually the first time that we took a dip into crypto. You know, I could have never imagined what would have happened in the 4 or 5 years after that. You know, a year later, Andrew went and started Nero Hashgraph, and then 4 years after that, became a top 30 coin. Right, and I would say with that groundswell, we brought along a team of guys that just got really fascinated by this technology. And so I would say, at the heart of it, we are crypto enthusiasts. Right? We've done everything from buying the craziest meme coin to dog coins to staking. But at the same time, we've also taken a deep love for the infrastructure. And if you look at all the projects that we've collectively been a part of, be it Hashgraph or be it Reserve or now Nillion, they've always had this very deep aspect of technology. And I think that's what makes Nillion so interesting. It's a pretty complex project, and so we're glad to really go deep into it for you guys today. But at the heart of Nillion, it's really looking at the foundations of what's happened over the last 5 years. It's really interesting because if you look at everything that's happened over the last 5 years, be it the infrastructure, the staking, the blockchains, the Bitcoins, the Ethereums, the Solanas, AVAXs, all that started in the 80s or earlier. You know, it's the same theoretical foundations that gave way to all of this. And so for people that are either academic or they've been in cryptography, this is a dream. You know, imagine working on something for decades, thinking that one day when computing power is strong enough to become something, and then suddenly within 5 years for it to become everything. It's pretty cool, right? And so it's fascinating because if you look at the core technology, say blockchain, blockchain is interesting because it was always meant to solve one big problem. And the problem was, how do we make and sustain a public ledger? Right? In a way, there are 10,000 computers can host it, and we can all keep track of it. And so, really fascinating, right? They found out a way to solve for immutable storage. They found out a way to solve for the order of transactions, and then also the value of transactions. And for everything that Bitcoin and blockchain was great for, the one thing that it was not built for was, it was never built for computing. It was always designed for a public ledger. Right now, it's interesting because a few years after that, you have Vitalik and Ethereum, and they found a way to take a quote-unquote smart contract and effectively bolt on computing power onto this ledger, onto this blockchain. But if you really look at it, we still see these like weird 1980s remnants of computing when we look at the current state of, say, Web3 or the centralized ecosystem. And it's because blockchains weren't meant for computing, it wasn't built for that. Right? And if you've ever, you know, I want to say something on Ethereum, or if you send someone to someone else on Ethereum, or you're taking out a loan, or you're trying to build an NFT, right? Depending on the gas and the congestion and block space, that thing that I'm trying to do will either take 30 seconds, and sometimes it will take 30 hours. It's crazy, right? And it all goes back to that simple idea. You know, what if blockchains just weren't meant for this? They weren't built for computing. Now, Nillion's really fascinating because Nillion is a network, just like Ethereum, just like Bitcoin and everything else, but it's a network that is completely built from the ground up only for computing. To the point where it only focuses on the value of something, not the order. So you can't use Nillion to run a ledger, you can't use it in the same way to send transactions, but what you can use it for is really fast, efficient, decentralized computing. Now, that's really crazy because if you open up a network where you can do something like that, you can take a network like Nillion, you can plug it on to networks like Ethereum, Solana, all the other big blockchains, and not only do you make it so that those blockchains can do certain things better, but you enter a world where you can do things that blockchains simply can't do. Imagine a world where you can actually have private data on public blockchains. Imagine a world where you can have faster scaling. Imagine a world where you can do these really interesting use cases that you just simply can't do because of the limitations of blockchain. Now, I say that as we looked at this technology, what we found was that this had contenders, right? The biggest contender to create a network like this was technology called secure multi-party computation. The problem with SMPC, or MPC for short, is just that it was just too slow. You know, it would take hours to do even a remotely simple calculation. The technological advancement behind Nillion is that they found a technology that's been able to unlock the speed so that you can have a network with many, many nodes, all running decentralized computations, and it can do it almost as fast as if you're running it on your localized computer. And that's why we're all so excited. And so we've been quietly building Nillion in stealth. 35-person team has been building Nillion in stealth for about 8 months now. And this is actually the very, very first event where we're going public with what we've been up to. It's the first day the website is live. We've been having kind of like insider conversations, but it's the first time where we've invited other funds, or journalists, or crowds, or people from the community into an event to kind of show you guys what we've been up to. Now, I want to say something quickly about Demetri and human forces. And, you know, as this thing has kind of picked up steam over the last few months, we've gotten a ton of invites from all kinds of podcasts to do something like this. We chose human forces for a very specific reason. And it's because, you know, crypto is an echo chamber, right? Anyone here that's in crypto, you guys know how it goes down, right? A new narrative comes up, it rolls onto crypto Twitter, it runs around crypto Twitter for like 2 or 3 months, and then it burns out, right? It moves on to something else. We like Demetri and we like human forces because Demetri's not truly a crypto guy. Actually, he's a technologist, right? His podcast has had hundreds of episodes, and only a handful of them are about crypto. You know, he's interviewed the likes of Eric Schmidt all the way to Vitalik himself. And throughout those interactions, he takes a very objective look at interesting technologies rather than the next hot coin in crypto, right? And so it's been a long time in the making to put this event together. We're going to have Demetri asking some really interesting questions about Nillion, how it works, why it's different, why it's special, why it effectively, quote unquote, doubles the design space of Web3. And then also we're going to have some of the co-founders from Nillion as well. We've got Andy Casasso, who is the chief strategist. We have Miguel Vega, who is the chief scientist, and then we have the CEO, Alex Page. So you guys are in for a treat. This is going to be a really, really interesting discussion. And with that said, I'd like to welcome you guys to the panel.
All right. I called this when I came in the Captain Kirk chair. You guys used to watch Star Trek, as we said, this is Miguel Vega, the chief scientist of Nillion, who was on my podcast several weeks ago, was it a month ago, Miguel? Edwin Santo, co-founder of Nillion and chief strategist, and Alex Page, Nillion's CEO. So guys, before we kind of have, I told you, so the way I envision this would be sort of a casual conversation. Since we've had enough conversations at this point, Miguel's been on the podcast before, and I feel like we can kind of, have a relaxed conversation about the tech and whatever else we're interested in. Of course, we're going to open it up for questions. I love taking questions, guys. A lot of people say, question ends with a question mark. I don't think that's necessarily true. But for me, what matters is that it's thoughtful and it's something that you really want to ask. So, just if you have something, please let us know. And I think Andrew Yo will be walking around with a microphone, and we'll eventually open it up for questions at a certain point. So before we do any of that stuff, guys, I'd love to hear from each of you a little bit about your background, who you are, how you got into this, how you got involved in Nillion. So, what about you, Miguel?
All right. So it all started more than 20 years ago. My background is a little bit of an intersection between technology and math. So I did 7 years of engineering studies in Madrid, and then moved to Austria and then Germany to work for Siemens, which is one of the largest tech companies. And there I was working and solving problems for different business units. And whenever they found something that they couldn't solve, that involved math, then we were this team that would come in, learn, and actually solve it. And so that shows that I already loved math at that time. And so I decided to go and actually do a PhD in math. And so I moved to Belgium, where there was these two professors that were really good at what I've been actually working on, which is probability theory. And I started doing a PhD on modeling the backbone of the internet, how traffic looks like when it's highly aggregated, and using things like fractal geometry, which is the math that you use for describing things like the branches of a tree or the veins on your body, things like that. And it turns out to be also suitable for something that is man-made, such as internet. It was a very intensive time. I think during a period of 3 years, I wrote 27 patents and several publications. And then there was like, I was also working for America at the time. And then there was like a plot twist in my career, as I completely switched and started doing software development. So I worked in language design, so the design of programming languages, and also machine learning and artificial intelligence. And in 2013, I met Rob Leslie, founder of Ceviche in London, and he was working on zero-knowledge proof, this cool cryptography that enables you to prove things without really showing what you have. And so I started collaborating with him, and in 2017, I just got formally involved as the CTO of Ceviche. And that's when I met Andrew. And we were kind of toying with the idea of creating a privacy coin using our zero-knowledge proof technology. But Andrew kind of saw that it wasn't quite the moment for that type of product, like Zcash or Monero. So we kept in contact, and I continued working on zero-knowledge proof, and then started working on secure multi-line computation. And the first thing you learn with secure multi-line computation is that it's very slow. So I tried and started to work on how to fix that problem. And that led to learning C technology. And so almost really by coincidence, Andrew reached out to us one day when it was like 2 weeks after we had solved this problem of NNC and big computations. He reached out to us, and we started analyzing and having conversations throughout the months as to what can we do with this technology. Initially, Will and myself were thinking about more like a permissioned environment where the nodes are very highly authenticated and so everything is secure. But these guys, because Alex was also there and we all convinced us to actually switch completely and think about decentralized networks. And that was the beginning of Nillion.
Amazing. Well, we're going to touch on a lot of the stuff you talked about right there, Miguel. Andrew, tell us about you.
So I was originally a banker and a lawyer. I worked for Rothschild for a year, and then for Linklaters, which is in London, for another 2 years. Shortly thereafter, I started a SEO and PPC company. I actually managed to catch the wave of 2006, 2008. Some of the people in this audience are actually my contemporaries from that time. And that was the first wave I caught. I built and sold a company there. In 2015, I retired and went to music school. The objective of making money wasn't as interesting to me as the excitement of being part of a new wave, and that truly was a new wave. In 2017, I discovered Bitcoin and blockchain in 2011. I bought Bitcoin in 2011. Unfortunately, it was with Mt. Gox. 2017, I discovered the idea of the hashgraph algorithm just while surfing AngelList, and it was being used for permission circumstances or instances. And I called the inventors and I said, hey, you want to start a public ledger? They said, we haven't really thought about this, but let's have a discussion. So then I started Hedera Hashgraph with them. And again, waves and timing, I have a sense for it somehow. It just exploded. It was, within 6 months of Founders Fund and Ribbon Capital and a bunch of big funds saying no to me, we had raised $100 million at a $6 billion valuation. It was crazy. In 2019, in 2019, I then went to start the Reserve Protocol, or I was the founding CMO, which is decentralized stablecoin, which is widely used to provide a stable source of value in places like Venezuela, Mexico, other places where you have issues with stabilization of currency. And then, the way I met the girl and the way this also happened is in 2017, a machine learning PhD from NYU came to me and said, hey, I've never seen anyone commercialize technologies like you and have a sense for waves. Why don't you come check out this new very zero knowledge group? Things are blowing up and you should check it out. So I assessed the technology, and it was indeed very innovative, but it would have just made a faster Zcash, right? A faster, while Hedera was not a non-blockchain way of achieving consensus, quite interesting in its architecture. This was at that point in time, it just would have created a faster private blockchain. It wasn't the right time for it. And we kept in touch. I kept in touch with Rob Leslie, our other co-founder. And in 2019, we discussed potential identity network. It wasn't the right time for identity at that point in time in the blockchain. Again, I had this sort of sense of timing. And in 2021, myself, Alex, and Andrew were in Mykonos, and on vacation, and I got an email from Rob, and he described to me this new type of technology, and I immediately thought, okay, this could be really interesting. So we canceled our holidays and flew to Brussels from Greece, spent 3 days locked up in the hotel rooms while our girlfriends were patiently sometimes sitting next to us in the room while we were talking about this new SMPC blockchain variant. And by the end of it, I was sure we had something really special. So, again, it sort of came from this sense of this pulse I kind of have of what will come next, what will be needed within the world, and I truly believe that Nillion is one of those things. I think we'll get into that a little later.
Yes, absolutely. Alex?
Yeah, so when I was younger, I was really into technology and computer science, but as Andrew kind of talked about with waves, when I was in college, the wave that was coming was the world of finance. So I did what a lot of people did in school and got my economics and finance degree and ended up working for a financial consulting firm, investment bank, including Goldman Sachs during my finance career. There was something about working at Goldman that just never really settled well with me, working with investment banking in general. And I think it was that there was this part of me that really had a desire to be a builder, and that was a big reason why I left and started my first company. We had a little B2C company selling products on Amazon, and it was the perfect time in that way as well. When Amazon and Amazon Prime and third-party sellers were becoming the big thing, we just happened to stumble into it on luck. And that was the first company that I had ever started. I worked on that for a long time, all the way up until 2017, when Andrew Santo, as the introducer, pointed out, Andrew Santo here gave me a call and said, what's the limit on your Coinbase account? How much can you buy in a day? And I was like, I don't know, like $50,000. And he's like, buy me $50,000 worth of Ethereum and I'll wire you 50 grand. And I was like, how many people have you asked to do this for you? And he said, I don't know, 4 or 5 at this point. And I was like, there must be something here if this guy is calling me and asking me to buy $50,000 worth of Ethereum today. And that's when I first started getting into the crypto space under the tutelage of Andrew. And
You missed the Hedera wave.
I'm going to get to the FOMO part, all right? So Andrew was one of the very early people that you showed the technology that underpins Hedera to, and he said, this is revolutionary, it's going to change everything. And I had my company, I had a pretty good life, and I was like, yeah, you go do that paper thing with this consensus gossip stuff, cool, good luck. And I watched him turn that into what it is today, a $15 billion protocol. But during that ride, I was still in the business space, in the B2C space, and again, something didn't fit in that space. I ended up leaving that company in 2019 and really diving into the crypto space, really doing a lot of investing, doing the degenning that Andrew talked about, but also looking for something to come and to help build. And that's when Andrew came to me again with the theses that we had for what was going to be happening in the next 5 years in crypto. And we started looking around at where our founders and technology technologies that we think are really interesting that we could get involved in, who's developing the next amazing thing where they need somebody to come in and create that go-to-market, they need somebody to build that marketing, they need somebody to be the strategy of how this becomes a major part of the way that we think about blockchain technology or decentralized technology in general. And we were looking at a couple of different projects up until the time that Andrew got that phone call from Rob and Miguel about coming and seeing that technology. And I won't tell the Brussels story again. I'll say my girlfriend, I don't know what she was up to the whole time for those 3 days, but we sat in that hotel room from basically 9 in the morning until 10 o'clock each night, drilling them with questions, going over the tech, asking a bunch of stupid questions from our end because this was all very novel to us as well. And when we reached the end of that, we knew that there was something here that had the potential to be revolutionary. We knew that the technology that had come forward was innovative enough to the point where we could really make something out of it. And once we got back to Brussels, and that was when the pen started hitting paper to say, that's what we started really working on, turning this into, I guess, molding this in many ways and flipping it over and over and over again until we got to where we are with Nillion today.
I think that's a big theme is, we found this when it wasn't really anything, and even when I started in Hedera, Alex and Andrew, my two best friends, or two of my closest friends, didn't see the potential in it, and I didn't founders fund, or so when and I think the reason is because I've been very comfortable with very narratives. One thing that you did say as well was that Alex helped build the genesis of Metalink and the community for Big Cloud in the very early days.
Yeah, so there's a lot there to get into as well, guys. You guys said a lot of things. One thing that, let's not do it now because I think the operating question is, what is Nillion? But I am curious to learn more about both of your experiences of what it was that each of you saw, right? What was it that attracted you to it, that made you think that there was something special here? Because I think every single person that encounters, whether it's Nillion or something else, has that kind of perspective of an interesting story to look. But Miguel, maybe you're the right person to ask this question. The obvious big question is, what is Nillion? We know what it's not. It's not a blockchain. You mentioned SMTC, Secure Multi-Party Computation, or MPC, Multi-Party Computation. It's a derivative of that, you could say, or it evolves from that class, but it's dramatically different in terms of its performance. So what is Nillion? Help us understand that, and especially given the fact that to the extent that the audience has familiarity with the space, they're going to be familiar with what is generally thought of as a public blockchain, right? A ledger that's public that you can audit. So what is Nillion? How is it different? And let's get into the weeds of that conversation.
Sure. So I guess the main difference compared to a blockchain is that blockchains are focused on storage. They're focused on a number of nodes keeping the state, a consistent state on a ledger, which is a record with several transactions on it. And so it's not really meant for computations, although with Italian and smart contracts and so on, then it has evolved into the computational space as well. The difference is that Nillion was conceived as it's an evolution from secure multi-party computation. So it was conceived from the beginning as a compute layer, not just storage, but compute. And the other difference is that it's secure. So on a blockchain, a typical blockchain, all the information is public. And so there's a restricted number of things you can do when everyone can see everything. So you can run the use case of digital assets, and that's fine, but you cannot run computation. You cannot really authenticate against the network because your customer will be completely public and exposed to everyone. So it's just one example of a computation that requires the concept of security. And so what Nillion is a secure compute layer. And that security means that the nodes can have information from the different viewers, not from the users participating, but that information is really not available to them. They cannot see what they're holding, and they cannot see what they're processing, but nevertheless, they can process that information and compute the outcome of computations such as authentication. So I can authenticate against Nillion, where my phase biometrics are somewhere there in the network, scattered across a multiplicity of nodes. And I can compare passwords, I can compare location and device information, but none of that information is actually available to the nodes, and yet I'm able to perform one function.
That's the name of the network, right? What Nillion actually means is a whole lot of nothing. And so what's stored in the network, you get into that if you'd like to at some point in time, is literally a whole lot of nothing. Another thing that's interesting is that Vitalik himself has said, I think numerous times, there are several key quotes that he believes, and Joe Lubin, the other founder of Ethereum, said this as well, that the blockchain itself is well suited to become the kind of record layer, but it is likely that the heavier computational capabilities are taken off chain somehow because they just weren't designed for that. And as decentralized computing becomes more and more prevalent in creating this ecosystem of Web3, that's just what's going to happen. So we are literally on the cutting edge of creating a fast, secure, decentralized computation network, which is really interesting. And that's also why I saw this as something that could be transformative. Like Miguel said, it isn't a layer one, it isn't a blockchain, right? It doesn't seek to order transactions. It seems to do many other things which can help facilitate a decentralized world far beyond what we have currently in blockchain.
So SMBC is a peer-to-peer network, right? Normally when you do something with SMBC, each participant has his or her own data. It isn't shared with that particular node or participant, and then a secret is shared and some information is computed, correct?
Yes, well, actually it can be implemented on top of a peer-to-peer network, but also on top of any other type of network. So it could be a network of authenticated nodes where each node knows to which one they're connecting, and those connections are fixed. But it can also be implemented on top of a peer-to-peer network, which is a kind of a decentralized approach. But the idea, as you mentioned, is yes, we're hiding the information that the nodes store, but yet you're able to.
So let's talk about that a second, because that was the thing that, going back to Andrew and Alice's experience of like what they found interesting, compelling, that's kind of what I found really compelling. The way in which data is not just computed, but stored hidden in the Nillion network. It's really fascinating. And I think it would be helpful to talk about examples of SMBC because you're going to get an appreciation for the transformational processing capacity of Nillion versus SMBC. So let's say we're each nodes in a traditional SMBC network, right? You, me, Andrew, Alex, members of the audience. Let's say we have I don't know, 10, 20 of us in here. We want to process something. We want to figure out some important piece of information. I don't know what. There's a plastic millionaires problem that we talked about on the podcast, which is each person is worth a certain amount of money. We don't want to reveal how much we're worth, but we want to figure out where along the distribution we all are. But there's all sorts of things you can do. Give us some examples of practical things that you can do with SMBC that has been used for. So we can talk about how it works, and that'll give us an opportunity to talk about Nillion and truly why it's so transformational.
So typical applications that have been used before are, for example, signatures. So I have a private key that is the one that allows me to sign, let's say, a transaction. And so instead of having the private key locally in my device, what I do is I split it into pieces using SMBC and send one piece to each one of these nodes in such a way that the nodes don't really have anything. They cannot get back to the private key from the piece they have. And that's a property, a mathematical property called information theoretic security. And so, but yet I'm able to get them signing messages for me. So transactions, for instance. In that I take the transaction, I break it again into pieces, I send it to the nodes. Now each node has a piece of that transaction, and of the private key. And now the signing process counts, which is the processing in this example. You mentioned the millionaires problem, that's another processing, but think about it as a programming language. You can type algorithms and then you have the nodes execute those algorithms. But the thing is that in SMBC, in traditional SMBC, all of these algorithms that involve multiplications, multiplying stuff, they require the nodes to exchange messages. So I, as a node, have to send one message to each one of the other nodes in the network, and I have to receive a message from each one of the other nodes in the network. Pair multiplication. So imagine if you're doing a lot of multiplication, that's a lot of time that gets lost in the communication between us. And that's the major problem with simplicity, because it really means that for very simple computations, it's already taking a lot of time, because that communication is very expensive. So that's why the only real applications of SMPC so far have been niche applications where the algorithm was very simple. Signatures is one example. Another one would be, I don't know, comparing things. Another one would be transferring the messages from one blockchain to another. It has to be really simple, because otherwise SMPC doesn't scale. But what we're facing here is the possibility to do way more than that.
But how does it work that you're able to hide data without encryption?
So, good question. Encryption is just a form of information hiding that comes from part of cryptography that is based on computational theory. And so it's based on the fact that there's some problems which are very hard to solve. And you put the problem between the attacker and the information that you want to protect. So that the only way for them to get to the data is to hack or to solve this problem, which is very hard. But there's nothing in the way to create crypto. You can create cryptographic primitives from a different corner of maths that is called information theory. It was, founded by Shannon in the 1940s. And the trick here is not to play with hardness, with the difficulty of a mathematical problem, but rather not to expose information to the attacker. So I'm gonna do something with the information that deletes those traces of data and of information, and so that the attacker, even if they have infinite computational power and quantum computers and whatnot, they cannot do anything with that message, with that encrypted message, because there's no information there to exploit, to harness. And that's how secure the technology behind Nillion is. That's what's called information theoretic security.
So, what are some examples of, again, because I do want to switch it to Nillion, but what are some examples of, or maybe you already answered this, of areas where SMPC is currently used in the practice, in the real world?
Yes. Another example would be away from blockchains. It's been used, for example, in anti-money laundering, where you have different banks, each one knows something about their customers, but there's regulations preventing those banks to talk to each other, data protection, bank secrecy. And so they create an algorithm that is able to assess the risk in terms of money laundering based on the information that is available at both ends. Another example used in Estonia, which has been a pioneer in secure multi-party computation, is cross-referencing data. Like, they found out that the computer science students were failing a lot, and they were thinking, is that because they're stupid, or is it because something else? So they cross-referenced that information with the tax records, just to make sure if they were working, and that was the reason why they were failing. And it was a computation that I think took hours and hours, because it was a large database, but in the end they were able to cross-reference those two things and really figure out that indeed they were not stupid, they were just working while they were stuck.
You guys have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is in the 80s, so computing was developed, right? And immediately you kind of think to yourself, well, everyone in this room has a computer. The basic problem is how do we create trust between each of the people in this room. Immediately, they came up with this theorem called secure multi-party computation, so that we could all kind of compute data, sometimes depending on the flavor of the data stream the data was, and get a result where if a certain percentage of all of us came up with the correct answer, then the resulting computation would be correct. That is what we call Byzantine fault. It actually underpins blockchain and decentralized computing in general, right? So SMPC then kind of developed this secure multi-party computation, and then from another stem of thinking was blockchain, which then kind of crystallized in 2008, I think, whenever the Satoshi Bitcoin white paper was written. So the proof of work algorithm, right, which solved a major problem, double spend problem, but it created basically what is essentially the blockchain era, right? But this other part of computation sort of has been there in the background. There are big businesses that have been built off it and use cases. So Fireblocks is an example of that, and some of the other examples that Miguel gave. And now we're reaching a convergence because blockchain was in created transactions. That was like the frontal, the tip of the spear into the public consciousness of decentralized and distributed trust and computing, right? But as Miguel said, you started to append computations to an immutable ledger. Why would you do that, right? Why calculate computations in transactions per section? It doesn't so much compute. It doesn't so much make sense. And then you have this SMPC technology, which when I saw it, it kind of occurred to me that this was almost like proof of work was to blockchain is what nil message compute is to SMPC. It's a way to compute where you don't have the restrictions of having to send many messages to each of the nodes. So we would never have to talk. We were all nodes in every person in this room was all nodes in a decentralized permissionless network. We would never have to talk to each other for us to be able to come to an agreement to a computation, as long as 1/3 of us were not honest, right? Were honest. No, well, not really. 2/3 were honest. That's right, and that's the Byzantine rule. And so, when I saw this, I was like, wow, this is a different way to look at decentralized computation. For the first time ever, we have a permissionless, decentralized computation layer, which comes with the added benefit of what SMPC had, which is information theoretic security, non-encryption, and computation, not order. So now you're looking at value, not order. So you're not looking at transactions. And yet, from the blockchain side, we borrow, permissionlessness and decentralized trust and tokens, if you like, staking mechanisms, if you like. So it's really the merger of the two, creating something that honestly the world has never seen before. So, yeah.
I think what's really interesting about SMPC's history as well is that the privacy and the security of SMPC has been recognized in the uses that have been done. When you think about Estonia and their use and the amount of time it took them to compute on this data, or the way that Fireblocks uses it with these private keys as a method of security, that part of what SMPC is capable of has been recognized as a very valuable piece. It's that scalability issue and that computation part that has always been what's holding that technology back and not allowed it to grow the way the blockchain has. It hasn't been able to be the tip of the spear because you couldn't scale and you couldn't use it in a way that was effective because of all of the messaging that would take place. And to add to what Andrew was saying, NMC itself seems to be asynchronous computation parts from blockchain as well, where not all of the nodes have to be doing the same thing at the same time in order to complete a calculation. That's one of the improvements that NMC has added. So it is almost taking something that people recognize as this secure way, great way to either compare pieces of information or secure pieces of information, but it's been restricted by this problem with the messaging and the time that it takes to do computations, and freeing it from that, and that's what we're seeing here with Nillion. So.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize something on the point about information theoretic security. What's also relevant is, again, to the point about how Nillion hides data, the distinctions between that and encryption. That's central to how Nillion is able to compute data while it remains private. And that opens up a whole range of use cases that currently aren't available. That's what excited me so much, whether it's computing genomic data, private health data, data that's highly regulated by governments, where regulation doesn't allow us to service those use cases. Other simple examples, like if you have an airline manifest list and you want to run it against a terrorist database. Right now, if you're going to do that, you expose all that information. But if you have an network like this, you can actually say, I want to see if any of these passengers on all of these flights are on a terrorist database. That's all I want to know. I want to know nothing else. I don't want to know their names, their heights, where they were born, nothing else. And that in particular is what excites me. Of course, all the points about off-chain computation, interoperability, all that stuff is super useful. So let's talk about NMC and the distinction between what we've just talked about and how you guys manage to eliminate the need for internet messaging, because this is what's so fascinating.
Yeah, that's actually the key of the issue. Well, in secure multi-party computation, you're typically relying on one building block, which is a cryptographic primitive. And you're asking of this primitive a lot of things, because it has to be correct, which means it has to run the computation in a distributed way, and then it has to give the right result when the nodes send the results back for reconstruction. But it also has to be ITS, as you said, information theoretically secure, and it also has to operate in the presence of characters. Just three things, one primitive. That's a lot. And so the idea with NMC is to actually divide and conquer and say, we're going to distribute those three things, but among or between two different primitives. And in doing so, we're going to get more degrees of freedom to design those two primitives. And so there's primitive number one, which is linear secret sharing. It's just about the mechanism to share secrets with a number of nodes. And we're going to use that to hide randomness. Some randomness that we will call blinding factors. So with this primitive, we're going to take care of the nature of operating in an environment where some actors are bad. That's assigned to this primitive, linear secret sharing. Now the other primitive, because it doesn't need to deal with that problem, we get more degrees of freedom to really design it for efficient computing. And to do that in such a way that the nodes don't need to communicate to run an algorithm. And that's a primitive called one-time masking. And now the next thing that we ask of the two is that both need to be ITS. It's like if you're having two Lego pieces and you want to put one on top of the other one, but at the interface, it needs to be ITS, because otherwise the connection of the two blocks wouldn't be ITS. So if you want information theoretic security as a whole, you need each one of them to be ITS. And in so doing this combination, the way it works is that if I have a secret now, what I'll do is take from the network the pieces to reconstruct the randomness using the linear secret sharing, and then I'll use that randomness to mask the information from my data. I will get a particle, which is what is ITS, and then I'll send that particle back to the network. And now the particle represents my data, but doesn't really have any traces of it. And you can operate with it as if you were operating with the secrets directly. So that if you want to add secrets, you add particles. You want to multiply them, you multiply particles. And that's the way the two primitives are connected.
So normally, let's say if you're using severe secret sharing, the secret is embedded. The secret is embedded inside of the polynomial, but it's hidden through LSS directly.
Exactly.
Whereas what Nillion does is it combines the one-time mask with LSS, with SSS, variants of it. And you use LSS to hide the shares of the blinding factor. And then once the information is masked, the individual nodes can compute it independently without actually knowing what it is. So you pick the most essential part of that operation, which is the least computationally intensive, which is the blinding factors. And that's where you use LSS, and then the rest is basically...
Exactly, because the problem was that LSS, if you want to use it directly on the secrets, on the information, it works for additions, but it doesn't work for multiplications. Then it's where you need the communication between the nodes. And so rather than trying to, square the circle, we just use LSS for just storing the blinding factors, not doing any operation with them, just storing them. But the operations, we do them with the other
Can I ask something? How do you... Because in some ways, if you explain it correctly, it seems kind of simple, right? But how do you come up with something like that seems superficially so simple, but which is such a breakthrough in terms of performance?
Well, there's no easy answer for that, rather than by searching a lot of possibilities. And by searching possibilities which are not evident, because there's very smart people who have thought during 30 years about this problem. And so obviously the solution is not going to be a mild tweak that you do to linear secret sharing, like Shamir secret sharing, or some minor modification. It's going to be something different. And so in testing completely different and new ideas is where you actually have a higher chance of hitting the requirement.
I just want to say, if anyone, I don't know if, at this point, if anyone has any questions, if you want to pass the mic around, I can't really see anything, because there's a bunch of lights here. Looks like we have one question here. We're just going to need to get a mic to Jared here.
While they're doing that, I do want to point out it is an important distinction that when you have particles that have been masked and are in ITS, one of the foundational innovative things about NMC is that we can run calculations against that information while it's in that secure form. When you think about encrypted information, you have to decrypt that information, then run an algorithm or calculation or whatever you want to do, and then encrypt it again. Now, cryptographic encryption is, a very new area, and people are working on it, but in terms of the computational capacity and the requirements for it and the time that it takes to do that and where it is as a technology, it's nowhere near where ITS is in terms of being able to run calculations on secured information. And that's a fundamental part of what makes Nillion so powerful, is that we do have that ability to take a piece of information. It is never revealed, yet we can use it in any way that we want to in any computation that we want.
It's funny because a lot of people talk about that, when they refer to Nillion, this information theory secure element of Nillion. But it almost comes for free as part of the creation of a computation layer. So we were objective to create a computation layer without the restraints of blockchain, but because of the way that you achieve it, you get a secure computation layer. I mean, it's information theory secure. It's not even encrypted secure, right? It's an unconditional security secure. So, what that does is it opens up a whole bunch of really interesting use cases that weren't evident or weren't possible with blockchain. Not just from the fact that you're doing different types of, using a decentralized network in a different way, focusing it on computation, but also, the fact that it's information theory secure.
So, and I want to talk about use cases, guys. Let's see. We have,
Jack one.
there, right there, Jared. Jared from Yahoo Finance.
Hey, Jared Blakely. I'm really glad you guys are saying decentralized computing and you're not just broadcasting DeFi. So I just begin with that. Two questions. One relates to what you were just talking about. The other is kind of big picture. I don't know if we have time to. So what you were just talking about, you're sending these particles kind of like broadcasting. How does it scale, and how do the receivers not get lost in the volume as the messaging volume picks up?
So there's just messaging during two phases. The phase where you kind of distribute your particles, but that takes place in parallel. And then the phase when the computation has finished without communication, and there's a particle that represents the output of that computation held by each one of the nodes, and they send those particles over to whatever node has been designated as the node which gets to reconstruct the result. And so, how does that match against scalability? Where it doesn't affect computation, because computations take place without any message exchange. And it slightly affects those two initial and final phases, because the more nodes you have, the more messages you send, but those take place in parallel, so it doesn't affect them that much. And the only thing that would be affected then is the cost of storage, because the more nodes you have, the more nodes that will need to have, to store those particles, and that will have an impact on the cost, essentially, of storage for the network. But essentially, you can scale in number of nodes, which gives you more security, at no price to be paid regarding the cost of computation. And that is the key element. We've broken that, that magic or that connection that's always been there between the price of computation and the security.
I think it's important as well to note your mobile phone can send out, hundreds of messages simultaneously, and this is just a mobile phone, right? Without experiencing degradation in speed or infinitesimal degradation in speed. I know you.
Yeah, actually, when you load a website, there's connections in parallel coming to you or what's right. So it's
So that's So I have let's say I'm the result. I won't send it back to me as a person, right? It sends it back to me. That's one message there, the compute, and then one message back. But it's sending it to a bunch of nodes in order to get that's the decentralized secure aspect, right? And that there is almost as fast as client server. That's why.
Yeah, I think I misunderstood maybe thinking that every node had to receive all the information to do the calculation, which doesn't appear to be the case. Did I not?
So, yes, it is the case because you want to have many nodes do the computation in parallel so that you can be resistant against the possibility that some of them are bad actors. That is the reason why you want to kind of do this in parallel with many nodes, but because they don't have to communicate, they act as if it was just one node doing the computation. They're as fast as one node.
Are you asking Jared for the amount of time it takes to spread all of the data across the network of nodes?
I guess basically, is this n log n, or what is it? What's the computational complexity?
So the computational complexity is the one that you would have in plain text. There is no difference. If your original algorithm runs in ON, so will it run in this private form? If it's ON squared, it will be ON squared.
Is there any kind of computational complexity related to binding factors?
No, it's very simple. It's ON, essentially. It's a very simple operation. It's linear algebra, and it scales with the number of particles that you're creating.
So the second question is a little bit more big picture. In the U.S., we have the Securities and Exchange Commission, various regulatory agencies. I think Gary Gensler at the SEC, probably the most aggressive. I think putting the U.S. at a disadvantage when it comes to decentralized computing. I understand why they're putting the brakes on certain DeFi projects because they feel like old kind of schemes rehash, or it's just kind of bringing crypto into the mainstream reality of finance. But I'm just wondering, I understand your product is very, very different. Do you see any kind of regulations in the US coming down the pike that can really stymie what you're trying to do in a decentralized computing network?
It's probably a question for Andrew or Alex.
Yeah, so I feel like yes, firstly, I see that coming for sure, right? Given the size of the network, the fact that you could be transacting on a DeFi network with terrorists, for example, and people are definitely looking at this. So one part of this network, let me address two parts. The first is one of the possible early use cases that we have envisioned is decentralized KYC. Why? Because you can store your identity in a network which doesn't store anything. It's literally information theory security. It's Nillion. It's a whole bunch of nothing, right? It's provably, mathematically provable that that there isn't a trace of your identity on the network. It's not like you hashed your identity or it's an encrypted file or something like that. And that then can form the foundation of what I think is decentralized KYC, which is really interesting to me. Thus, decentralized KYC, where you as the individual hold the right to that identity, can remove it because it's not an individual ledger, so therefore you have the right to be forgotten, right? So thus being GDPR compliant, right? And yet never having a trace of your actual identity on the network. Also allowing you to prove who you are to a potential government without even showing, or it doesn't have to be a government, it could be a bank or some sort of regulated entity, without ever having even to show them the data on the network. You could do a compare function without ever having to do that. So that's the first. I actually think that that's actually the way that this is all going to go, especially as crypto becomes more and more prevalent. And the second is, as I mentioned, this is a GDPR compliant solution. It's something that in 2019, when Miguel and Rob came to me, they said, we think that identity will one day come onto a global network. I think that's correct, but I don't think you do that as a frontal motive. I think you need a GDPR compliant solution. You can't just have hashed identities or encrypted identities. I think you need something like this. that has the right to be forgotten, and where you can't just steal a bunch of encrypted identities and then put them away until the invention of the higher levels of computing power, which is what some criminal organizations do, or perhaps governments do as well. In this situation, you have something where that information is ITS, doesn't leak any information, and you have the right to be forgotten, and thus you have a GDPR compliant solution. So my intention with this is to sort of go where the puck is going, because I do believe that that is going to be a hot narrative in the future.
Love it, thank you.
I think what's really interesting about that use case as well is that it is a way of providing identity and decentralized identity, and what these DeFi platforms are going to be as regulation comes down the pipe, but still speaks to the true nature and I guess the underlying idea of decentralized identity, where they don't have to go out and collect this information from like a normal KYC individual or company that does that specifically, and then you can store it in a way where they can ask those questions that they want. They can get that information they need to be able to comply with whatever rules are in their jurisdiction, but they also don't have to be, Uniswap doesn't have to collect everybody's passport and banking information, right? It can be in a place where they just can be sure that you're not this person or don't live in this country, and then everything else they don't have to collect, and they don't have to be one of those big data aggregators now and be regulated in the same as bank.
Something interesting about that solution as well. It isn't something we're trying to build. It comes free with what we need to build for the network. This is something I realized this is the first time I've said this publicly, but the founding engineer of Uber had joined us as our CTO. And as I was discussing with him, the engineering pathway of Nillion, we were sort of talking. We were like, well, at a base level, we're going to need to authenticate who you are in order to get to the data that you're putting on the network, right? So let's think about this. If I need to authenticate who you are, how do I do that on an Ethereum ledger? I do that with a private key. But that's a simple compare function of, does the public key match the private key? But with the Nillion network, what you can do is have several layers of authentication. It could be a public key, a private key, it could be a password, it could be a matching of this side of your face or of the vectors in your face. It could be a fingerprint, it could be a multi-sig authentication, which is more like what Fireblocks uses SMPC for. You're talking about a network that can authenticate using several factors where it never actually has to, were you to store a private key in there, it would never have to reveal the private key. It could just create signed transactions and put it onto another blockchain. Right? This is the power of having a computation layer built on SMPC, or rather NMC, right? Nil message compute, rather than blockchain or SMPC. So you get that identity use case almost for free. Thing is, I hate talking about identity use cases because the graveyard of identity blockchain projects is long, and it will continue to be filled with tons and tons of projects. I did a lot of research when Miguel and Rob, out of respect for the innovation that I saw out of Miguel a couple of years ago, did a lot of research, and the only way you can attack decentralized identity and thus decentralized compliance, what I found is to look at countries like Brazil, in the case of Unico, or the Temasek organization in terms of Singapore, and see how identities have actually been put on centralized servers where 70% plus of the population is actually on a single database. And that's always been by way of providing a use case. So in the case of Brazil, it was fraud detection. In the case of Singapore, it was passport verification. But you need to provide a use case. You can't just say, hey everyone, your identity is going to be on the decentralized network now, can't stop your network. So I don't like talking about identity use cases, but it is central to the question because that is where compliant angles of decentralization and government are going to go.
Andrew almost went there, but to expand on it too, when we're talking about these authentication methods that we can use, whether it's the fingerprint or biometric or voice recognition, where you can do something as crazy as iris or even DNA as an authentication method. Not saying we're going to build any of those things, but it is possible. All of those pieces that would authenticate you, whether it's that picture or biometric that is on the network, or it's that voice that you're matching in against, all of that is masked and stored in ITS in a way where none of the nodes that are doing that authentication of you through biometric voice or what have you, they can't see any of those pieces of information either. So when Andrew's talking about Unico in Brazil, they're fighting the online fraud by using biometrics and a piece of identity to fight the e-commerce fraud, but they're holding those biometrics and those IDs on their centralized encrypted database. So they have a picture of a face matched to an ID for 70% of the population of Brazil, right? That is a massive amount of people that you have very sensitive information on that one company now controls. With Nillion, you can do the exact same thing on authentication with a wide range of multi-factor authentication methods, and none of them are on our network. The nodes don't know anything about you. They don't know what your face is. They don't know what your voice sounds like. All that information is dispersed in a way where, in reality, we're the person that controls it, and none of the parties involved in actually recognizing that that's you when you're logging in or authenticating yourself. None of the parties out there that are doing that authentication know anything about you.
And yet, once you have that piece of data on the network, even though it resembles nothing, it can then be used at your request for every other potential use case. Decentralized LastPass, the KYC one that we just said, a firewall solution, the biometric data that Demetri had said, or storing your private key by way of hiding it by way of your biometric password, two-factor authentication, etc. So it scales naturally through this hidden data, because that hidden data is useful for many other potential use cases.
I think the decentralized LastPass is a great example to think about, because it's one of those things where everyone has experience using something like that, or Apple's keychain, and you always kind of wonder, well, where the key is stored? Like, how secure are they really? Because ultimately, they're secured in a centralized database. So how would, and I see, by the way, that we have a question back there, we're going to go to you in a second, but how would something like that work with Nillion? And how would it be tangibly, materially, meaningfully more secure?
So, it's funny because you have this, I have a money in Ethereum network, decentralized network, secured by a decentralized network, and I take this private key. I don't know where you guys put it, but apparently you're supposed to put it in a best-in-class solution. Have a piece of hardware, a hardware wallet that has a seed phrase, but that seed phrase is a wire-carded envelope in a safe zone. It's still centralized, right? It's still stressful. It's super stressful too, like extremely stressful, Or hide it in your LastPass, still a centralized server, still all centralized points of failure, right? It doesn't really make sense. So with Nillion, what we want to do is to create a permissionless network, which is ITS, which can, as one of the use cases, store a private key, and even not allow the reconstruction of the private key. All it does is it just reconstructs signed transactions onto blockchains, so that once you authenticate, you tell it what to do, you never get the private key back. All you do is tell blockchains what you want them to do with their money, right? That's a cool concept, because then the way you authenticate is, let's say for me personally, I would do, a biometric, a password, right? And then I'd probably do, if it was a lot of money, I'd probably do a two-factor authentication, and maybe a multi-factor authentication. All programmable in the network, right? It doesn't rely on me having a private key, and then I can tell the Nillion network to tell the Ethereum network to send that Ethereum or that USDC somewhere else, etc., right? That to me is a super cool potential use case where you finally decentralize the whole world.
And this isn't a theoretical thing,
No.
and nor is it isolated to crypto. Data integrity and authentication are like central to the future of the internet. I mean, today, right? Like hacks and data integrity issues are like huge. Simple examples that we talked about on the show are easy hacks. You could hack the blood record database at a hospital, and people could just start dying on tables. These are actually like theoretical attacks that people consider mounting. So there are all sorts of ways in which this is relevant. There's someone back there who has a question to ask.
Does this work? Hi, it's Jesse Ash, Grimmy Media. Congratulations, guys, on launching this, and I mean, the math and science, I'm a filmmaker, so it's way above my head, but Miguel, you talk a lot about bad actors and adversaries. What's keeping you guys up at night? Is it the ghost of Goldman Sachs past? Is it what they're authoritarian regimes that are going to bring you down? What's the biggest adversary that you see in terms of taking this?
Yeah, very good question. In terms of security, because I guess your question is about security, you have many different layers that you need to take care of. So you would have the network layer and the storage layer. They are susceptible to a number of attacks, but and then again, it's well known what kind of things you can do to prevent that from happening. Then the core of the network itself, which is where you have the bad actors, the nodes which deviate from the protocol and try to do something else. That's also okay because you can work with the numbers that Andrew was referring to. You can design the network in a way so that this type of attack is really hard. The maths, okay, no problem there. The problem that I have is at the client level, so frontal attacks. Because that's before even you're touching Nillion's logic, Nillion's code, that you may have a virus in your computer, malware, something maybe, someone may be watching over your shoulder and take the secret out of you before you even particleize it and send it over to the network. That kind of attack is very hard to address. You can always harden the mobile application or the device where you deliver Nillion's SDK and the code. And one thing you can do is to use trusted execution environments, which is a hardware area of the mobile phone, which is secure. And it can also even have access to the user interface. And it's a completely separate area from the rest of the hardware that is accessible to other programs. But there's no silver bullet here. So that's one thing that, or the most, the thing that worries me the most.
Yeah, I mean, and Miguel brought it up, and it's very similar for me. I mean, I'm CEO a lot, I'm CEO at night, but I think the idea
That's
of
why you're CEO.
Yeah, I know. So you can sleep well. The idea that the device that the dealer node is using can be compromised, and thinking back to in September of 2021, about 6 months ago, when Apple sent out an update to finally take care of the Pegasus exploits. If you guys know what Pegasus was, it was a software that was developed by an Israeli defense contractor, where they basically found a way to break into your iPhone. And Apple had, for a long time, I remember back in, I think it was 2016, when the government asked Apple to build a backdoor into their encryption, and they refused to do so because they said it was so hardened that we don't want to build a backdoor because then that's going to allow all these people to exploit it. And it turns out somebody had for years and been selling it to state governments. And that software is watching what you were doing on your phone. And so if you were interacting with the Nillion network and Pegasus software was on there, then there could be somebody watching the secret that you were putting onto the network. And it's that point which is the part that really concerns me in how we structure all of this properly and what we can do for users to make sure that they are in a very secure environment when they're using it, because Apple, of all people, was hacked by this software Pegasus that was being sold to governments, and it was just, 6 months ago that they finally put in a patch in place to prevent that from happening. So that's where a lot of concern is what happens on the devices that are outside of the network. There's nothing that a software like Pegasus could do to get onto our network because of the authentication issues they would face, but on the device, they could see what that secret was.
Okay, there's someone over here with a question, I think.
Hi, I'm Josh Vogel. So first off, I just want to say it was a fantastic presentation. You guys gave these are really great answers. All three of you guys are clearly clever folks, and I've been following the things that Andrew Massanto has been doing for the past decade. I can attest to the fact that generally he's well ahead of where I am, and I consider myself to be well ahead of a fair number of people. That said, where I'm not ahead is very lay. I have a very lay understanding of certain technologists, things behind the technology and the math, and so I appreciate you guys presenting that in a way as I understand. So that said, apologies if this is a self-evident answer, but my question is, these nodes that you're talking about that are doing this authentication, who are these nodes? And if they're not you, which maybe they are, but if they're not you, then what is the incentive or the motivation for someone to be having a node on your system?
Well, I mean, so we are building a permissionless network, and so any anybody could be a node in terms of how we have the structure of, there's essentially going to be two different types of nodes. There's going to be light nodes and there's going to be full nodes. Light nodes are the holders of particles and can hold, as many particles as they want. They participate in calculations. And we're going to have full nodes, which are going to be governed by what we call a Dow support score and a node health score that is going to look at the activities, the behavior of those nodes, and other factors to decide which nodes can be full nodes on the network. So in terms of who can be a node, anyone can be a light node. Who's going to be a full node is going to be the really good actors that are known and that are supported by the decentralized network. And as part of the way that we are thinking about the construction here, the tokenomics of the project, we are going to use staking as a mechanism to align incentives. In order to participate on the network as a node, you will have to stake, and you are putting those tokens at risk depending on the behaviors that you take. One really great thing about the way that the mathematics and the construction of the network works is that we can see who is being a bad actor on the network. So when we're talking about, with Miguel, and was talking about error correction, and if there's one node in a calculation that comes back and says, forget it, I'm sending the wrong result, in that error correction we can identify which of the nodes was the bad actor in there and can take action against them to preserve the integrity of the network. Now, the full nodes are obviously going to be highly trusted because of the way that they, because of the support scores and the things that they'll have to do to be good actors in the structure, and they'll have to stake more. But there is, and then, on top of that, there is an incentive structure for nodes that are on the network where they will receive compensation in order to run a node. So to undertake calculations, to store blinding factors, to store particles, there will be an incentive structure that is built around that so that people that are using the network will need to pay with nil token or something similar in order to participate in the network and incentivize the node to run the calculations, and they'll receive those tokens as payment for the time that they spend running calculations or storing data, what have you.
Okay, thanks a lot. And just to be super clear, so to be a full node, then you would need to go through some sort of authentication or verification with you guys, or would this be based on the scores that were accrued over time?
I think initially, perhaps, right, as we bootstrap the network, but over time, the scores will be down to how much you're staking, what your availability is like, how many times you've been flagged for issues on error correction, etc. The DAO will determine that in the best interest of the network. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think maybe we maybe bootstrap it like that, but over time I don't see that being an issue. In fact, I actually think that sometimes that you may want to dox yourself as a full node because it just leads to there's no other reason to remain anonymous in that network. But
the issue at hand is a civil attack, right? A single node or entity actually owning many different nodes has a large portion of the network and doing with that whatever they want. And so to prevent that, as Sandro says, at the beginning, when we don't have many nodes, then you need to maybe add this layer of authenticating the nodes, do some enrollment. But eventually, when the network is large enough, then that won't matter because it would be economically unfeasible for anyone to own a large proportion enough of nodes to do any harm.
it's like Ethereum staking, right? Now Ethereum has such a huge market cap, it's difficult to get enough Ethereum to be able to affect its validation under a proof of stake system.
That's exactly what I was asking, because Binance Smart Chain did 21 validators staking, but they did verification ahead of time to make sure that they weren't.
Yeah.
Yeah, however you want to do it. I just noticed that there was one there. I think there was someone there too that raised his hand.
Okay.
Is there anyone else, just so we know where they all are? Someone here? Okay. The flood's coming now. All right.
In the white paper, it states that there's two groups of nodes, the T+1 nodes and then the rest of the nodes. How would the network resolve node failure? Not necessarily malicious nodes, but how does the network resolve node failure, and how does that affect computation between the two groups of nodes, right? The T+1 node fails versus another node. And do these nodes know which group they're in?
So essentially, the way to prepare the network against this type of failure, which is not malicious in nature, is to add redundancy. So to improve the high availability of the network, the particles are replicated across multiple nodes, and so are the shares. So that if one node goes down with a share, that share will be available for another node that has the same copy. And then regarding the two groups, there's actually a logical separation that has no consequences. Because in essence, T+1 is a parameter, a design parameter for the network. It tells you the amount of shares that you need to be able to reconstruct a blinding factor. And it doesn't matter if it comes from this set of T+1 nodes or from this set of T+1 nodes. What matters is the number itself. So it's really, there's no need for a node to belong to a group or to another one in that sense.
Hey everyone, I'm Grant. Thanks guys for these answers. It's been really helpful. You know, one thing that just kind of popped in mind is you see the runway for what this can change. You get really excited, but I think one thing that I'm curious about, and maybe this is too far down the line, but you know, when you look at kind of the current state of affairs of just people understanding technology and just over, I mean, whether it's congressional hearings, whatever it may be, you know, something that I'm curious about is how are you guys thinking about the overall approach of getting people to understand, you know, a layperson that really has no technical understanding, how do they get up to speed on how transformative this is?
You know, I think that, well, firstly, we've been given a gift because of this crypto boom and the fact that people are interested. But I genuinely think that eventually it's going to come down to utility and use, and not to the technology. The technology is super cool. I keep saying, you know, you don't need biz dev if you've got good marketing. You don't need marketing if you've got good product. And you've got good product typically when you have very good technology and engineers, right? And product people, you know. And so I'm focused in this protocol much less on getting people excited. People are getting excited about the technology, but I want the engineers and the product people because I want to create products that people end up using, you know? And that's really the focus. So I appreciate and I love the fact that so many people, and you guys are like the earliest in the space right now to discover this new paradigm of thinking. I appreciate that technological bit, but I think that, you know, the broader audience, taking it to this general public that you are referring to is going to happen at the product level. And this is honestly, Conrad, when we first looked at this, our CTO, who literally built Uber from he was Garrett's housemate, roommate in college. He said to me, you know, we have to focus on product here. This technology, well, he read the technology, he's like, this is super cool, the physics is amazing, etc. Getting the right people interested, right? But then we need engineers and product people to be able to make that into a layer which we can build products on top of, which excite other people. And that is also why, within the way that I built this, if I think about the way I built the other protocols, the mistakes I made were that I was so focused on the technology. Guys, Terra was a cool technology, but I didn't focus on the ecosystem and on the resulting product. And that's why, as part of our founding team, a lot of the compensation of the people in the founding team is to do with the products that eventually get built off it, as opposed to just the expression of the technology itself, if that makes sense. So, you know, it will be a factor of education about that, you know, and a simpler narrative as to how to express the coolness of this technology, and, you know, the contrarian narratives get people excited. But when it comes down to it, you know, to hit something where we actually, you know, make a dent in the universe or potentially change the world, we have to create new products. And that's kind of the focus.
It is embedded in the DNA of our project that we are building an ecosystem around this and see Nillion as really an infrastructure layer that we're building out, whether it's in the meta layer of the blockchain or into the real world in terms of the use cases there. But like Andrew said, we have these entrepreneurs that are embedded within our team that are going to go out and build products for this, but we're also building an entire ecosystem bringing in what we call founding entrepreneurs and educating them on Nillion and then helping them develop products as well, because it's not going to be Nillion as an entity going out to, say, like major banks and selling an ALM product. It's going to be a founding entrepreneur who's built something that they're selling and uses it. Nillion has its back in its infrastructure. And so we are really focused on identifying those people. We brought many of them in early as part of the founding team, but at the same time, that ecosystem is where those products are going to come from that I think a lot of consumers or businesses or other people are going to interact with that are built with Nillion being the layer beneath them.
Yeah, top 10 cryptocurrency, Luna, right? Terra Luna, and I built Reserve, or I was the founding CEO of Reserve, right? I mean, they're both algorithmic stablecoins. Why is mine around 100 and that one around 10? These are the questions that I ask myself every day, you know? And what happened was, as part of the Terra Luna founding team, they both worth millions of dollars. I don't think I failed, but still, you know, one's worth over 10 and one's worth 1. And so, or 2. And so, you know, when I think about it, it's because as part of the Luna founding team, they built Anchor, Mirror, and Chai. That was all internal, right? They built a use from that founding team. That's something that I've taken. It's something that I consider to be, you know, an evolution of the way we have to think about not companies, but Web3 businesses or projects.
Well, there are a lot of people raising their hands. I don't know where the microphone is though.
Right here. Okay, is there thanks so much for the talk. My name's Adam Manzoni. When do you plan on transitioning governance power to the DAO? What parts do you feel comfortable? And what current DAOs are you going to learn from with that initial Genesis proposal to the community?
So, by the way, Jack, I see there's still one person that wanted to ask a question. I see a couple people over there, and it looks like more people are raising their hands. So, okay, yep.
Not only we had Tristan up on the stage.
Our resident DAO expert is literally right there, so you can ask him that at some point in time.
But I will say that we are approaching it, we are doing a lot of research into building the best DAO structure we can, and taking a lot of inspiration from other DAOs, just so to give you the list specifically. But I see it as a phased approach in governance moving over to the DAO, where we're going to start with is probably going to be with how the nodes are controlled in terms of the support scores and the node health score and factors that go into that and what that looks like, and we'll slowly transition different pieces over time. What that roadmap looks like is still being developed at this point, but our goal is for this to be a public utility as opposed to some project with shareholders and all of these things. I mean, we went to Switzerland and established an association which is very similar to a foundation out there to be the basis for this, simply because we wanted to make sure that the incentives were all aligned on the network and on the token, and we'll transition that over time into being the DAO that is in control, because this should be a public utility for people to use. It shouldn't belong to a centralized company and should have those incentives as a part of what makes Nillion.
Yeah, but the DAO research guy on the team, Mr. Computer Scientist from Northeastern over there, Tristan, he's one of the guys who wrote the white paper as well, so he just didn't tell us his company.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was amazing. Well, my first question was about the DAO and whether you were going to have a DAO, so that's answered. The second question has to do with you as a company, Nillion as a company. So I'm hearing a lot of products that you're going to be selling. I'm hearing a lot about test cases. Then I just heard something about public utilities. So are you going to make money? Is the objective for you to make money out of this project, or are you going to be public good? Just trying to understand how you guys are thinking in terms of a company, a profitable company going forward.
So we are just building the base layer, and we are incentivizing people to build off the network. The entrepreneurs who build off the network, they keep all that equity for themselves, right? They can build for profit or not for profit, it's up to them. We want to be a pure Web3 company with the understanding that, or Web3 public utility, with the understanding as the founders who are building this, that we need to encourage the first use cases, because as I said before, and then in answer to the other question, as you get more use and data into the network, it becomes more and more valuable. So I see it working at some point in time, more likely Ethereum Foundation.
Go ahead. Yeah. Two questions, both of them are kind of crude. One, is there software today that I could download to run and operate the network? And two, kind of drilling down, will there be like a pre-mine, and what portion will be allocated to the founding team, and then what will be allocated to what this war chest that you're building to incentivize development in the sort of Terra model?
So we, the first part of the question, sorry, was around
Software. Are you a software engineer?
Never reported.
Okay. I was gonna say you went wrong. Yeah, you were saying so.
Yeah, so regarding the software, the answer is currently no. So we are an internet, which means internal development network, with nodes are all owned by us. The next stage will be the testnet, which will be a controlled but permissionless already environment, and then the internet. And so we think that it's going to take us approximately 4 to 6 months until we are in the testnet. And there you could, if you're interested, engage with us, and we will share the software.
The token economics side, we have about 20% of tokens that are going to be set aside for incentivizing team members. And we also are going to be doing a fundraise where they'll be receiving tokens for the funds that those that participate in that round. We are setting aside a pretty decent number of tokens for what I consider to be community and ecosystem together. What the exact amount of that is still being finalized as we kind of think about over time how we want the reserves to look, what we want to plan for, what we want to give to the DAO when it starts to support it. So those numbers are a little bit in flux, but there will be a pretty significant amount that is going to be going towards community incentivization for founding entrepreneurs and kind of fueling all the little things that come from, whether it's a program to get people really interested in the program or in Nillion, or some of the incentives that we're going to put forward, we make airdrops, things like that. Some of these are still in the pipeline, but that portion for the founding entrepreneurs is going to be wrapped up into how we think about building the ecosystem. It just hasn't been completely defined yet.
Yeah, I think, interesting, as a Web3 project, you do want a couple of signals, right? I don't know if that's best expressed through funds these days, you don't need to fundraise from VCs anymore these days. If you have a strong community, strong technology, good team, etc., the market will actually support you to do that, So it's almost a little superfluous to have, a very sort of, I call it open ground approach of like, look how many people back us, etc. That being said, you do want liquidity, right? And not liquidity for teams. Definitely you want liquidity so that the treasury can sell into the market when there is the demand, thus not creating these crazy spikes when everyone buys ICP, everyone walking into the top 10 now, it's like 80 billion val now, it's like 5 and whatever, right? And so there are token economic considerations like that. We will be at some point in time releasing a token economic sort of white paper to discuss that. It's currently being worked on by several University of Cambridge people who joined our team after we did a talk at Cambridge about the technology.
Hello, my name is Sage Lezion. I was just wondering, because Nillion is a computing platform that computes using secrets, right? So I'm wondering, after the computing has been resolved and been done, and we have like a new data point, does that go on the blockchain itself, or are these secrets coming from the blockchain? Like, where do these secrets come from, and like, what happens after these secrets are used? Like, where does the product of those secrets like go to?
Is that generally a question about where is the data stored?
Like, kind of yes, but more just like, where does the data travel after the computing is done? Like, it's a convergence between blockchain and a computing platform. So like, where does that convergence like?
So there are different configurations. In one configuration, you can think about Nillion as being an off-chain layer because it's not a blockchain itself. And so in that configuration, the data could go back to the blockchain. But generally, because Nillion has its own consensus mechanism, which doesn't require messages to be exchanged, it can live in and of itself, on its own. It can You can just finish the computation, deliver it to whomever wants to consume it, and that's the end of it. You don't need to really rely on a blockchain underneath to be able to do, some kind of settlement or, to give some audit trails. Because Nillion is able and capable of doing that on itself.
If you wanted to, you could. Yeah, totally. And that's what the target said, right? Use Ethereum as the settlement layer. And that's a great use of the blockchain. But you can see how it's a different layer. It's kind of a better layer if you like.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
You have a question?
Yes. Hey guys, JB, thanks for the great talk. Impressive. Is there a simple explanation for how the particles can be processed while separated without any node interaction? Just struggling to get my head around that.
Can you repeat it?
How the particles can be processed while separated without any node interaction?
Yeah. In essence, the particle is the result from applying the secret blinding factor, a set of blinding factors. So you can think of it as being a multiplication. So essentially, because the multiplication is commutative, you can multiply particles, and that will give you the multiplication of the secrets and some multiplication of blinding factors. Now, the next operation you want to be doing is addition. So you want to prepare things, the blinding factors, in such a way that once you multiply them, all the blinding factors kind of cancel each other out and disappear, and then you just have the multiplied secrets that you can add then later on. So in essence, the idea is, okay, let's add some blinding factors to the data so that the data is protected. But those blinding factors are going to disappear as you operate that data, as you compute on that data, so that they are removed, and what you end up with is the multiplication and addition of the secrets, which is the actual result from the computation that you want. You would really need to look into the math to get a grasp of it, but that's kind of a high level idea.
We had a University of London Royal Holloway professor look at the mathematics, and she came back and said, this is really, really innovative, and ended up joining our team. So that was my due diligence of the math. But I had this same question with you. I'm not really a math person. Pretty good.
My monkey brain is like having trouble.
I have monkey brain too.
I have one last question. Is 24 months from now, what is your vision of them? What is your hope that you see for this creation?
I hope that firstly we've got this groundswell of interesting people, right? And people who are interested, in the math and the technology, and that they all come in early. I hope to be able to release a token soon as opposed to later, and the reason I want this is because I don't want there to be this high horse venture capital sort of winners. I want the people sitting here to be able to buy early, etc. Not that any of the founding team invested in the original rounds either. Actually, there's one or two who pilot everything he can, but no one in the stage is investing in that early stage. So I want to have other people come into this. So where I want in 24 months is for that community to grow similar to the way Ethereum grew, right? As opposed to we are backed by all these great VCs, which is fine. We could be, and we might be, but I don't want it to be the story. I want it to be a story of this community that sees the potential, these founding entrepreneurs and parts of the founding team that are really enthusiastic about potentially building off it, and where they actually they're talking to Conrad, our engineers, as almost like athletes. They're like, hey, I need this to happen. Look at the way I need to construct data in order to make this use case happen, right? So that what's happening is after the 6 to 18-month period, you've got these use cases happening. Now, as you get to the 24-month period, what I want is for one, ideally, then hopefully more, but one use case to start really catching fire, whether it's KYC, decentralized KYC, or decentralized LastPass, identity biometrics, interoperability, private NFTs, private smart contract, it doesn't matter to me, right? If one propagates, then the fact that you're using our network to authenticate will propagate the other use cases, will help the other use cases. And then that's when the Ethereum effects happens, and hopefully within 24 months, you start having these really interesting use cases pop up all over the network, and then it becomes this global network of nothing, which literally holds everything to do with whether it's identity or passwords or whatever. It's a very contrarian narrative, right? Store your secrets in plain sight. You know, it makes me feel like when someone first told me internet money, like that was really weird to me. But you know, I want those contrarian narratives, and I think that is a possibility for what happens in 24 months.
So guys, I want to give people a chance to get to talk to some of the members of the founding team as well as each other members of the audience. I think we have one last question, is that right? Or we're good? Okay,
Unless there is.
So good. So actually, so guys, that was amazing. I have to say, wonderful questions, guys. That's why I love opening it up to questions, because you get such interesting thoughts and people get engaged, and it has a completely different vibe. So thank you for contributing that way, and I look forward to. Go ahead.
One thing before we part ways really
Yes,
quickly.
please.
For a project like this, we really, as Andrew has said, it is really about the groundswell. It's about the underpath, not the overpath, in terms of how we're building up this project, which is why we're doing events like this, as opposed to going out and splashing ourselves all over CoinDesk or wherever. We really want to build a solid community at the foundation of this. And because of that, we are very, very focused on our community and taking care of our community. I can tell you that the guys who are in the back of the room, and some of them who aren't here, we literally reached out, DM'd every single person for the first 1,000 people that joined our Telegram, just to talk to them and ask them how they got there and what they were interested in, so that we could understand our community better. On each of your chairs, there was a little flyer that has a QR code that leads to a link tree where you can join our community. Our community is the first place where everything comes out. It was the first people to see the white paper. It was the first people to see the light paper. It's the first people to get the FAQ. It's the first place where we announce everything, because at the end of the day, their support is what
Waves, NFTs, tokens,
yeah.
All we want to reward the community.
All the things that are coming up are coming through our network, and so there is that QR code if you want to join any parts of our community. I also will say from most of the events that we've done so far, we've met one or two amazing people who have ended up joining part of the team. And so there is also an email there as well where you can get in touch with us, or you can talk to us here, or if you're in the media, there's a way to outreach where you can get in touch with the members of the founding team. But that community is at the core of everything that we do, and it's a place where people can ask questions about technology, and they're going to be the first to see things like, I don't know, I've seen the hoodies around here, they're really highly in demand. People keep asking about our IHO or initial hoodie offering. That is the foundational core of Nillion. So if you want to join that community, that QR code is the way to get there really easily. And hope to see
And look for the people in the blue jumpers, and they're all part of the team, some of them read the white paper, etc.
Amazing, guys. Fantastic.